Okay, David, we're starting a new series here. We're looking back at Derbyshire's 5 trophy wins. 5 really notable moments in our more than 150-year history. We're going to start with our sole, to date, county championship win in 1936. Now, I think it's important to provide some context to this win with the years prior. I know you've extensively looked into this, and just give me a bit of background.
Well, actually, before World War I, Derbyshire had signed a guy called Harry Blackledge from Surrey, who ostensibly was to come to Derbyshire to create a cricketing nursery, which would have been the equivalent of today's academy. Sadly, war broke out, and Blackledge perished during that war, so was unable to undertake that role. And then when the First World War ended, Derbyshire's cricketing stocks were very, very low, and of course the nadir came in 1920 when Derbyshire lost every single game that they played. Never happened in the history of the game before, and the Derbyshire committee of the time decided something needed to be done. They reinvigorated the idea, or reintroduced the idea of a nursery, but this time they approached Sam Cadman, who was a cricketer who played either side of World War I, 10,000 runs, nearly 1,000 wickets, was very, very well respected within the game, and said, will you create the nursery? And so during the 1920s, Derbyshire started to recruit young players, a lot of them from the coal mines, and also as the decade progressed, they uncovered a captain in Guy Jackson who would lead them, and Guy was rather like the man who would succeed him, Arthur Richardson. Very tough, uncompromising, very clever man, and had been an officer in the British Army. And together there was this kind of desire to want to bring through local cricketers, which was generally the case anyway in county cricket. And so during the 20s, people like Garnet Lee, in the late 20s, Dennis Smith, who would go on to be in the championship side, and Stan Worthington, who was at the heart of the championship side. These were the players that emerged. Harry Storer was another, Harry Elliott, and all of these were well-known names by the time we got into the 1930s. So as the early 30s broke, we'd added Tommy Mitchell to the side. We'd also got people like Bill Copson, the Pope brothers, Arnold Townsend, Leslie Townsend, Albert Alderman, who would eventually become the core of the side that would win the championship in 36.
Yeah, and as a team, it wasn't just the 36 championship that you would regard as success in that time, because over a 5 or 6 year period, Derbyshire were among the best teams in the country.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the average points for the decade of the 30s, Yorkshire, Kent and Derbyshire were the top 3. In between 1933 and 1938, we didn't finish outside the top 6, and in 1935, 6 and 7, we finished second, first and third. So what a time to be alive watching Derbyshire. They really did sort of bestrode the county scene. And indeed, John Arlott wrote some wonderful words many years later when he said that Derbyshire's side had a gladiatorial quality to it, and shall we ever see their like again? And he said, to date, there seems no sign of it. So they must have been a very, very impressive side. But again, you've got to remember, these were largely coal miners. So they were tough people in the first place. And in the second place, playing cricket must have seemed like a day off by comparison to digging a coal seam. So you throw all of that together, and they were very disparate individuals. They didn't all necessarily get on, but put them in the hands of a wonderful captain in Arthur Richardson, who was not a particularly good cricketer. He was a batsman. His highest career score was 90, but he knew how to handle people. And so, yes, during that period, a glorious period for Derbyshire cricket, and some outstanding players that came to the fore during that time.
Of course, you've looked so far into the history of Derbyshire. You know all there is to know about the history of Derbyshire, but Derbyshire have had some great captains over the years. But in terms of a 36 winning captain, firstly, how important was that role, particularly in those days where maybe coaching wouldn't have been quite at the fore as it is now, but also as a leader, how important was that on the field?
Well, I think Guy Jackson had set the template for captaincy at Derbyshire, which was, first of all, give nothing away, because Derbyshire never ever had the luxury of, particularly during that period, of free scoring batsmen. They had good players with the bat, but they didn't have the greats. There was no Dennis Comptons or Jack Hobbs ever played for Derbyshire. So they were very, very tough in the field. They concentrated really hard on making sure that the fielding was of good standard. But I think essentially his role was to understand how you were going to get the best out of people. A good example is probably someone like Tommy Mitchell, who was a real maverick. Now, Mitchell was described by one great Australian whose name slips my mind at the moment, but one of the great Australians in the 1930s said of Mitchell, you only see about half of how good he could be. If he'd actually concentrate on playing the game properly, he could be twice the bowler. Now, this is a guy who took 100 wickets every season he played Test cricket for England, was an astonishing leg break bowler, had come from Morton Colliery, but who seemed to treat cricket as a kind of a bit of fun, which, going back to the comment I made earlier about coal mining or cricket, it must have seemed like a day out really, playing cricket rather than working under the ground. But I think he was described, Mitchell would often just walk out to the middle and take up his bowling mark and just sort of send the fielders wherever they wanted to go. Now, for a captain to have to deal with that, when at the same time he's got people like George Pope, who was a giant of a man, and his brother Alf, who were wonderful all-round cricketers, and then you've got Dennis Smith, who famously could be cantankerous, wonderful cricketer, but could be cantankerous. Then you've got the magnificence of Bill Copson, who in the championship year took 140 wickets at 12.8. So you've got a real disparate group of players, and then Stan Worthington, of course, who was probably the only way. I never saw Stan play, obviously, but reading the contemporary accounts of his time when he played cricket, for those who've seen Chris Adams play, he was a strong, tough player who hit through the line, scored a century in 60 minutes at Ilkeston against Nottinghamshire, but a very tough cricketer. Scored a century for England, of course, in Test cricket, but was also a bowler. Took 600 odd wickets for Derbyshire. So his strength, Walker's strength, was in understanding his men, recognising their strengths, understanding that there were mavericks within them, and then bringing them all together. Now, how you do that? Well, we'd all be captains if we thought we knew how to do it. But he had that something. Maybe the fact that he was from a well-to-do family, he'd been well-educated, so he's completely different from then. You look at all the photographs of the team of the day, he's got a striped blazer and a cravat on. Well, that wasn't how Tommy Mitchell operated. So maybe it was the fact that he was so different that enabled him. More modern example might be Mike Brearley, who was a very, Rodney Hogg described him as having a degree in people. And maybe that was the kind of an example, you got a rough and ready cricket team, but you've got an intellectual understander of people running the game.
Yeah, and I think just when contextualising the 36 championship, it's important to understand that not every county has won the championship. And the vast majority have been won by a select few counties. So for Derbyshire to have that place on that list, it is significant, isn't it?
It was a staggering achievement, basically, from when the county championship was developed into what we know it now in the late 19th century. You had the two London clubs, Surrey and Middlesex. You had the two northern clubs, Lancashire and Yorkshire, and Nottinghamshire. And then the outliers, if you like, were Kent, who, although we see today as a relatively small county, Kent was the heartbeat of cricket in this country for a long time. So they were classed as the Big Six. And they were the only teams that won the championship until 1911, when Warwickshire won it. Now, surprisingly, you might think of Warwickshire today as one of the big counties, but back in 1911, they weren't. So they broke the mould. But until 1936, no one outside of those counties I've just mentioned ever won the championship. It would be another 40 plus years before Essex won it, 40 years before Leicestershire won it, and of course Somerset, Gloucestershire, Northamptonshire have never ever won it. So it was absolutely a remarkable achievement, but it was on the back, as I said before, of this confluence, if you like, of great county cricketers all coming together at the same time.
And of course, in that great period, when you're having that kind of success, you will naturally have great players within that team, and Derbyshire boasted 7 Test cricketers at that time, which I suppose really any side with 7 Test cricketers in, if they were all to perform, you're going to be competing for a championship.
Absolutely. I mean, Dennis Smith, who was from Somercotes, he was from the coal industry, tall left-handed batsman. But a great example of because we tend to think that cricket was a more obdurate, calm, slower game back in the day. But in the 1930s, we played a game at Chesterfield. Hampshire were dismissed for about 160 in 58 overs, batting first on the first day. By the close, Derbyshire were 300 for 1 and Dennis Smith had got a double century. Now, you imagine coming in mid-afternoon and scoring a double 100 by the close. You know, he was he was a very extravagant stroke player. Scored 30 centuries for Derbyshire. Only in first-class cricket, 3 players have bettered that: John Morris, Kim Barnett, and Wayne Madsen, of course. And he's still our second leading run scorer in first-class cricket. But then you've got the 2 all-rounders, the 2 spinning all-rounders. So Les Townsend and Stan Worthington. Stan, he bowled cutters actually rather than spin, but he could bowl spin. Stan was very, very strong, very competitive cricketer. Les Townsend, wonderful bowler. Bowled off spin, took best part of 1,000 wickets for Derbyshire. Also scored 17,000 runs, 6 centuries in a season. When no one had ever done that until people like Peter Kirsten and John Wright came to Derbyshire, but he did it for Derbyshire in the 30s. Harry Elliott, who was the wicket keeper, he played Test cricket for England, took 292 stumpings for Derbyshire, many of them off Tommy Mitchell, leg break bowler who we discovered at Morton Colliery, and apparently the way he learned to spin the ball, to bowl leg breaks, was using a pool ball. He would stand at the pool table and do that with the ball up and down the table to strengthen his wrist, his arm, his everything to try it. And then of course you've got the pace bowling all-rounders, George Pope, who was giant of a man, big, tall, good enough to bat at 6 and score double centuries, but also he could take 10 wicket matches, 5 wicket alls, real proper all-rounder. Think Dominic Cork 80, 90 years ago. And then of course Bill Copson, who he'd got he himself described himself as having unnaturally long arms, which gave him a real whippiness to his action. But he was seen as being a little bit, although he'd been in the coal mine, seen as being a little bit weak. And this is like a story from the boys' own annual. They sent him to train with Chesterfield Football Club during the winter before the championship winning season. He came back, he was slightly heavier, more robust, took 140 wickets in 12.8. It's a staggering number. Yes, there were 28 matches played in the season, but still 140 wickets at 12.8. Quite remarkable, really. So yeah, they were the heartbeat of the side and good enough to play Test cricket. And so, it comes as no surprise really that was our greatest championship side.
Lastly, the biggest thing to take as well, you've talked about how they were described as having a gladiatorial spirit. That's something that's carried through with Derbyshire through the decades. I know it's been talked about in the past, Middlesex wouldn't play Derbyshire in the early days because they were described as being ruffians. So there's always been a bit of a rough and ready reputation with Derbyshire. But the hard-working kind of grassroots team, that's something that resonates with support as well, and that's something that we still want to see today.
Absolutely. There's a lineage. There's a lineage, first of all, with fast bowlers, which Derbyshire always had. But if you look at the successful teams that Derbyshire have had, we've talked about this 36 side that have got players who, I say this in the nicest possible sense, were confrontational, were aggressive, seemed to be almost hewn from the same granite as exists in the North Derbyshire Peak District. But if you then fast forward to Les Jackson and Cliff Gladwin, the kith and kin really of their predecessors. Look through the later years that people like Barnett and Peter Bowler and Stan Mortensen and Dominic Cork, these are people who would similarly, they'd run through a brick wall for you. And that's what you see with the very best of Derbyshire teams. It's been more about character. I mean, obviously you can't win without skill, but character, and I'm sure we'll come to this through these the conversations we have going right through to 2012, that there was something about the character of the people that were playing the game on top of the talent that they had.